A broken mountain man inherited a cabin so rotten the roof had caved in, and animals lived in the walls. Everyone told him to burn it down and walk away. But when he pried open a rusted metal box buried beneath the kitchen floor, his hands trembled. Inside were documents that would either make him the richest man in Montana or get him killed, trying to prove they were real. Because what he discovered wasn't just worth $3 million. It was proof of a conspiracy that powerful men had spent decades trying to hide, and now they knew he had it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The March wind cut through the Montana mountains like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of another hard winter ahead. Marcus Dalton pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as he trudged down the muddy main street of Pine Ridge, population 847, according to the faded sign at the town limits. His boots had holes that let in every puddle, and his stomach hadn't seen a proper meal in 3 days. At 52, Marcus looked older than his years. His weathered face told the story of 2 decades spent alone in the high country, trapping fur that fewer people wanted each year, mining claims that never panned out, and slowly watching the world change around him while he stayed frozen in time. His dark hair had gone grey at the temples, and his green eyes held the weary look of a man who had stopped believing in second chances. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled as he walked, the official seal of Brennan and Associates law firm still unbroken. He'd been carrying it for a week, afraid to open it because lawyers never brought good news to men like him. The postmark showed it had come from Billings, and the return address meant nothing to him. But somehow they'd tracked him down to his one-room shack outside town, and that was never a good sign. Marcus pushed through the swinging doors of the Rusty Spur Saloon, the only place in Pine Ridge where a man could get warm without spending money if he nursed a beer slowly enough. The bartender, Jake Morrison, looked up from wiping down glasses with a rag that had seen better days. "Marcus." Jake nodded, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. In small mountain towns, a man's business was his own, and Jake had been tending bar long enough to know when someone was carrying troubles. "Jake." Marcus slid onto a bar stool that wobbled under his weight. The saloon was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just a few old-timers playing cards in the corner and a traveling salesman nursing a whiskey while he waited for the afternoon stage. "Beer." Marcus patted his coat pocket, feeling the few coins he had left. "Just coffee if you got it." Jake poured him a cup from the pot that had been brewing since morning. The coffee was bitter and thick, but it was hot and it was free refills if you didn't ask too obvious about it. Marcus wrapped his calloused hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The letter seemed to burn in his pocket. He'd been putting off opening it for days, but sitting here in the dim warmth of the saloon, he finally pulled it out and broke the seal. The letterhead was embossed and official-looking. Brennan and Associates, attorneys at law, established 1892. Below that, in neat typing, was a message that made him read it 3 times before the words sank in. "Dear Mr. Marcus Dalton, we regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Jeremiah Dalton, on February 15, 1952. As his sole surviving heir, you have inherited his property located at 47 Settlers Creek Road, approximately 12 miles north of Pine Ridge, Montana. The property consists of a cabin and 47 acres of mountain land. We understand the structure is in poor condition and has been vacant for several years. Property taxes are current through 1952. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of deed and keys. Respectfully, William." Brennan, Escort Marcus stared at the letter until the words blurred. Jeremiah Dalton. He had a vague memory of his father mentioning a brother who'd gone west before Marcus was born. But the old man had never talked much about family. Marcus had assumed he was the last of the Dalton line, just him and whatever children he might have had if life had taken a different turn. Bad news? Jake asked, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. Marcus folded the letter carefully. Seems I inherited a cabin up on Settlers Creek. Jake had lived in Pine Ridge for 40 years. He knew every piece of property for 50 miles around. That's old Jeremiah's place. Been empty for nearly 5 years now. Last I heard, the roof was caving in and the bears had taken up residence. You knew him. Jake leaned against the bar, settling in for a story. Jeremiah Dalton was what folks politely called eccentric. Lived up there by himself, came to town maybe twice a year for supplies. Paid his bills in silver coins, real ones, not the new stuff. Always had money, but nobody knew where it came from. Some said he had a mine up in those hills, but if he did, he never registered it. Marcus felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. What happened to him? Found dead in his cabin in winter of 47. Doc said his heart just stopped. The town buried him in the cemetery and used his silver to pay for a proper headstone. Jake polished the same glass for the 3rd time. Nobody ever claimed his property, figured he didn't have kin. The afternoon light, streaming through the saloon windows, had turned golden by the time Marcus finished his 3rd cup of coffee and worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at him. Jake, you got a horse I could borrow? Just for a few hours, the older man studied him with shrewd eyes. Planning to take a look at your inheritance? Figured I should see what I own before I decide whether to keep it or sell it. Jake disappeared into the back room and returned with a set of keys and a worn leather bridle. Old Buck's in the stable out back. He's not fast, but he'll get you. There and back, just make sure you're back before full dark. That road's tricky in the shadows, and there's been talk of wolves coming down from the high country. Marcus had been riding since he was old enough to sit a saddle, but it had been months since he'd been on a horse. Old Buck was a patient bay, gelding with white around his muzzle, and the steady gait of an animal that had seen everything and couldn't be surprised by much. The ride to Settlers Creek took him through a country he knew well, past abandoned mining claims and forgotten homesteads where optimistic families had once tried to carve out lives from the unforgiving landscape. The road to the cabin was barely more than a trail, overgrown with mountain laurel and choked with fallen timber. Marcus had to dismount twice to clear branches that blocked their way. The forest pressed close on both sides, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rush of water over stone. When he finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, Marcus understood why Jake had warned him about the condition of the place. The structure had been built from local pine logs, probably around the turn of the century, but time and weather had not been kind. The roof sagged in the middle, and part of the front porch had collapsed entirely. Windows were boarded up with rough planks, and the stone chimney had cracked, sending chunks of mortar scattered across what had once been a yard. But the foundation looked solid, built from local granite that would outlast the wood by centuries. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the road, with what looked like additions built onto the original structure over the years. Despite the decay, there was something about the place that spoke of better times, of a man who had taken pride in his home even if he'd lived alone. Marcus tied Buck to a pine tree and approached the front door. The key Jake had given him was old iron, worn smooth by years of use. The lock was stiff with rust, but after some coaxing, it turned with a click that echoed in the afternoon quiet. The door swung open on hinges that screamed in protest, revealing an interior darker than the approaching evening. The smell hit him first, must and dampness, old wood and something else, something animal. Jake had been right about the bears. Claw marks scored the walls near the door, and there were droppings scattered across the floor. But as Marcus's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he began to make out the shape of the single large room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with old ashes and debris that had fallen down the damaged chimney. Along the opposite wall stood a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove and shelves that still held mason jars and rusted cans. The floor was wide plank pine, warped in places where water had gotten in, but still solid underfoot. Near the back of the room, a ladder led up to a loft space under the eaves. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but Marcus could see that the cabin had once been well appointed, even comfortable. He spent the next hour exploring, taking inventory of what remained. There wasn't much value that he could see. Some furniture too heavy to steal, cooking pots too dented to be worth hauling away, and personal effects that spoke of a solitary life. Books with water-damaged pages, a chess set with half the pieces, missing clothes that moths had turned into lace. In the loft, he found a bed with a mattress that mice had turned into condominiums and a trunk filled with papers. Most were receipts and personal letters, but at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a collection of maps. Hand-drawn maps of the local mountains, marked with symbols and notations in his great-uncle's careful script. Marcus spread the largest map on the dusty floor and knelt beside it. The detail was extraordinary. Every creek, every ridgeline, every game trail was marked with precision, but what caught his attention were the symbols scattered across the map like stars, small crosses, circles and squares, each accompanied by numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. One symbol, larger than the others, was marked with a red X and the notation JS 47 3M. The location appeared to be somewhere up the mountain behind the cabin, in an area Marcus knew was too steep and rocky for easy travel. He was so absorbed in studying the map that he almost missed the sound of hoofbeats on the trail. Old Buck whinnied from where he was tied, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. He hadn't told anyone where he was going except Jake, and Jake wouldn't have followed him. Moving to one of the boarded windows, Marcus found a gap between the planks that let him see out. 3 riders sat their horses at the edge of the clearing, and even in the fading light, he could tell they weren't friendly visitors. The man in the center was tall and lean, wearing a black coat that looked expensive. The other 2 flanked him like guards, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. "We know you're in there," the man in black called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Come out and let's have a conversation like civilized men." Marcus's mouth went dry. He had no idea who these men were or what they wanted, but their presence here couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, word of his inheritance had spread faster than he'd expected. "I'm armed," he called back, which was true. He carried an old Colt revolver that had belonged to his father, though he hadn't fired it in months and wasn't sure the ammunition was still good. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The man in black chuckled. "I'm sure you are. But we're not here to cause trouble. We're here to make you an offer. Not interested? You haven't heard it yet." The man dismounted with fluid grace and took a step toward the cabin. "My name is Vincent Crane. I represent certain business interests in the area. We'd like to purchase this property from you, assuming the transfer goes through." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How do you know about inheritance? News travels fast in small towns, Mr. Dalton. We're prepared to offer you $5,000 cash for the cabin and the land. That's more than this place is worth in its current condition." $5,000 was more money than Marcus had seen in his entire life. It would buy him a new start somewhere, maybe even a small spread of his own. But something in Crane's voice, something in the way he sat his horse and the type of men he rode with, set off every alarm Marcus had developed in 20 years of surviving on his own. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus called back, "but I just inherited the place. I'd like some time to think about it." "Of course." Crane's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. The market for mountain property can be volatile." The three men mounted up and rode away as quietly as they'd come, but Marcus knew they hadn't gone far. He waited until full darkness before, leading Buck out of the clearing and starting back toward town. The ride seemed to take twice as long as it had coming up, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding watchers. By the time he returned Buck to Jake's stable, the saloon was closed and the streets of Pine Ridge were empty. Marcus walked back to his shack on the outskirts of town, his mind churning with questions. Who was Vincent Crane, and how had he learned about the inheritance so quickly? What business interests did he represent, and why were they so eager to buy a worthless piece of mountain property? The shack was barely more than a lean-to, built against the side of a hill, where the wind couldn't get at it as badly. Marcus had constructed it himself from scrap lumber and tar paper, and while it wasn't much to look at, it was warm and dry, and it was his. He lit a candle and sat at his small table, spreading out one of Jeremiah's maps. In the flickering candlelight, the symbols seemed to dance across the paper. JS 47-3M. What did it mean? The letters could be initials, the numbers could be dates, or quantities, or map coordinates. Marcus had worked enough mining claims to know that prospectors developed their own shorthand, their own ways of recording information that meant everything to them and nothing to anyone else. He studied the map until the candle burned low, trying to make sense of the notations. Some were clustered around creek beds, which made sense if Jeremiah had been panning for gold. Others were scattered across ridgelines and steep canyon walls, places where a man would have to be part mountain goat to reach. But the red X behind the cabin, the one marked JS 47-3M, was different. It was positioned in a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountain, a place that would be sheltered from wind and weather, hidden from casual view. The kind of place where a man might hide something he didn't want found. Marcus blew out the candle and lay down on his narrow cot, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the wind moaned through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The sound reminded him how alone he was, how far from help if Vincent Crane and his men decided they didn't want to wait for an answer. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with clouds building over the high peaks. Marcus walked into town early, before most businesses had opened, and made his way to the post office. Martha Hendricks had been the postmaster for 15 years, and she knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. "Morning, Martha," Marcus said, leaning against the counter while she sorted mail into wooden pigeonholes. "Marcus Dalton," she said without looking up. "Heard you came into some property." News travels fast, faster when strangers come asking questions. She turned to face him, her sharp eyes taking in his worn clothes and worried expression. "Had 3 men in here yesterday afternoon. Wanted to know if anyone had come asking about mail for Jeremiah Dalton. Told them we don't give out information. About our customers." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. What did they look like? City men. Expensive clothes, soft hands. The leader was tall, dark hair, and spoke like he was used to giving orders. They weren't happy when I wouldn't tell them anything, but they left peacefully. "Did they give names?" Martha shook her head. "Didn't offer, and I didn't ask. But I'll tell you this. They asked about you specifically, wanted to know where you lived, how long you'd been in the area, whether you had family." Marcus thanked Martha and left the post office with his mind racing. Somehow Crane had known about the inheritance before the lawyers had even contacted him. That suggested connections, resources, the kind of organization that small-time mountain men didn't usually tangle with and lived to tell about it. He spent the morning asking careful questions around town, trying to learn what he could about Vincent Crane without seeming too interested. The answers he got weren't reassuring. Crane worked for something called Mountain Development Corporation, which had been buying up land all through the region for the past few years. They claimed to be interested in timber and mineral rights, but nobody seemed to know exactly what. they planned to do with all the property they were acquiring. What everyone did know was that people who refused to sell to Mountain Development Corporation had a way of changing their minds. There had been accidents, mysterious fires, problems with suppliers who suddenly couldn't deliver materials or extend credit. Nothing that could be traced back to the corporation, but enough of a pattern that smart people took their offers seriously. By afternoon, Marcus had made up his mind. He borrowed Buck again and rode back out to the cabin, this time armed with a hammer, a crowbar, and a determination to find out what Jeremiah had hidden that made this worthless piece of property so valuable. To Vincent Crane, the cabin looked even more decrepit in the grey daylight. Water stains on the walls showed where the damaged roof had been leaking for years, and the smell of animal occupation was stronger than it had been the day before. But Marcus ignored the decay and focused on the structure itself, looking for the kinds of hiding places that mountain men used when they didn't trust banks. He started in the loft, pulling up floorboards and checking the spaces between the wall logs. Jeremiah had been thorough about filling the chinks with mud and moss, but a few sections seemed newer than others, as if they'd been replaced recently. In the main room, Marcus examined every plank in the wide-board floor, testing for loose sections or hollow sounds that might indicate a hiding place underneath. The kitchen area yielded nothing but mouse droppings and the remains of forgotten meals, but the space around the fireplace was more promising. The hearthstones were massive slabs of local granite, fitted together with the skill of a craftsman. But when Marcus tapped them with the hammer, one sounded different from the others, more hollow. He worked the crowbar into the mortar joints, chipping away the old cement until the stone shifted. Underneath was a cavity that had been carefully carved out of the earth, lined with stones to keep it dry. And sitting in that cavity was a metal box, roughly the size of a bread box, sealed with wax and wrapped in oiled canvas. Marcus lifted the box out carefully. It was heavier than he'd expected, and when he shook it gently, he could hear the rustle of papers inside. His hands trembled as he worked at the wax seal, scraping it away with his knife until he could lift the lid. The papers inside were yellowed with age but in good condition, protected from moisture and insects by Jeremiah's careful preservation. The first document was a survey map, officially stamped and notarized, showing the boundaries of a mining claim that covered nearly 1,000 acres of mountain territory. The claim was registered to Jeremiah Dalton and dated 1923. The second document made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was an assay report from a certified laboratory in Denver, dated 6 months before Jeremiah's death. The report detailed the mineral content of ore samples from the claim, and the numbers were staggering. High-grade silver ore, some samples running nearly 70% pure. Conservative estimates put the value of the deposit at over $3 million. But it was the third document that made Marcus understand why Vincent Crane was so eager to buy the property. It was a letter from Mountain Development Corporation to Jeremiah Dalton, dated just 2 weeks before the old man's death. The letter was polite but firm, offering to purchase the mining claim for $50,000. At the bottom, in Jeremiah's shaky handwriting, was a single word: never. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. Jeremiah hadn't just been a hermit living alone in the mountains. He'd been sitting on one of the richest silver deposits in Montana, and the Mountain Development Corporation had known about it. When they couldn't buy him out, they'd waited for him to die, probably expecting the property to go unclaimed so they could acquire it through tax default. But now Marcus had inherited it, and the documents in his hands proved that he owned not just 47 acres of mountain land, but a fortune in precious metal that was literally buried in his backyard. The sound of hoofbeats outside made him look up sharply. Through the gap in the boarded windows, he could see Vincent Crane returning, this time with 5 men instead of 3. They spread out around the clearing with the precision of a military unit, blocking every possible escape route. Marcus quickly closed the metal box and tucked it under his coat. The documents were too valuable to leave behind, but if Crane suspected what he'd found, he might not leave the clearing alive. "Mr. Dalton," Crane called from outside, "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." Marcus moved to the door, his hand on the butt of his revolver. "I told you I needed more time. I'm afraid time is a luxury we can no longer afford." Crane's voice had lost its pretense of politeness. "You see, we've learned some disturbing information about this property. It seems there may be certain legal complications with the title, issues that could tie up the inheritance in court for years." "What kind of complications?" "Mining claims that were never properly filed, tax liens that go back decades. Very messy business. But Mountain Development Corporation has lawyers who specialize in clearing up such problems. If you sell to us now, we'll handle all the legal issues, and you'll walk away with clean money." Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Crane was lying, but he was doing it smoothly, professionally. The kind of lie that might fool a desperate man who didn't know any better. "And if I don't sell?" Crane's silence was more threatening than any words could have been. Finally, he spoke again, and this time the steel was right on the surface. "Then you'll find yourself dealing with those legal complications on your own, and mountain property can be dangerous. Mr. Dalton, accidents happen. Men get lost in the wilderness and never come home. It would be a shame if something happened to you before you could enjoy your inheritance." Marcus made his decision. He eased the door open and stepped onto the sagging porch, his hands visible but close to his weapon. In the grey afternoon light, he could see that Crane's men were professionals, the kind who made their living with guns and weren't afraid to use them. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare," Marcus said carefully, "but I think I'll take my chances with the lawyers." Crane's face hardened. "That's unfortunate. We really had hoped to resolve this amicably." He made a small gesture with his hand, and his men began to close in. Marcus drew his revolver in one smooth motion, a movement that came from muscle memory built over decades of frontier living. The old Colt was worn, but reliable, and he'd loaded it with fresh cartridges that morning. "That's close enough," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Crane raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Now, Mr. Dalton, there's no need for violence. We're all reasonable men here. Reasonable men don't surround a man's property with guns. We're simply here to protect our investment. Mountain Development Corporation has already invested considerable resources in acquiring the mineral rights in this area. Your great-uncle's claim represents a complication. In our long-term planning," Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "You killed him." Crane's smile was thin and cold. "Jeremiah Dalton died of natural causes, according to the official death certificate. His heart simply stopped working. These things happen to old men who live alone in the mountains, especially when they refuse to sell, especially then." Crane took a step closer, and Marcus could see the pale grey of his eyes, like winter ice over deep water. "But you're not an old man, Mr. Dalton. You're young enough to start over somewhere else, maybe California or Oregon. $5,000 would buy you a nice little spread, far from the complications of mountain property." Marcus knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he also knew that if he gave up now, he'd never see another sunrise. Men like Crane didn't leave witnesses, and he'd seen too much to be allowed to walk away. "Tell you what," Marcus said, backing toward the corner of the cabin, where a pile of old lumber would give him some cover. "Why don't you and your boys ride away and let me think about it overnight? Come back tomorrow morning, and maybe we can work something out." Crane laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I don't think so. You see, we know you found something in that cabin, something that's made you think this property is worth more than we're offering. "We can't allow you to leave here with that information." One of Crane's men, a heavy-set gunman with a scar across his left cheek, started moving around the side of the cabin. Marcus swung his revolver toward him, and the man froze. "Easy now," Crane said. "Nobody needs to get hurt. Just put down the gun and hand over whatever you found. We'll make it quick and painless." Marcus had spent 20 years in the mountains, and he knew that trapped animals had two choices: surrender and die, or fight and maybe live. The choice was easy. He fired twice, fast, the heavy bullets splintering the wooden porch where Crane had been standing a second before. The corporation man dove for cover behind a fallen log, shouting orders to his men. Marcus rolled sideways as return fire chewed up the ground where he'd been standing, then scrambled behind the woodpile. The battle was brief but fierce. Marcus had the advantage of knowing the terrain and fighting from cover, but Crane's men had superior numbers and firepower. Bullets whined off the granite foundation stones and chewed chunks out of the pine logs. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of pine resin and fear sweat. Marcus counted his shots carefully. The old revolver held 6 rounds, and he had 2 spare cylinders in his coat pocket. Against 5 professional gunmen, that might not be enough, but it would have to do. A flicker of movement to his left made him spin and fire. The scarred gunman cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. That evened the odds slightly, but now Marcus was down to 3 rounds in the cylinder. "Enough!" Crane shouted from behind his log. The firing stopped, leaving only the ringing echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. "You're only prolonging the inevitable, Dalton. Surrender now, and I give you my word, it will be quick." Marcus used the lull to reload, his fingers working by feel while he kept his eyes on the clearing. "Your word isn't worth much to a dead man." "Perhaps not, but consider this. Even if you escape here, where will you go? We know where you live, where you buy supplies, where you drink your coffee. Pine Ridge is a small town, Mr. Dalton. There's nowhere to hide." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. Even if he won this firefight, even if he killed all of Crane's men, Mountain Development Corporation would send others. They had resources he couldn't match, connections he couldn't fight. A man alone couldn't stand against that kind of power unless he wasn't alone. The thought came to him suddenly, along with the memory of something Jake Morrison had said the night before. The whole conversation came back to him now, details he'd missed in his worry about the inheritance. Jake had mentioned that people were starting to ask questions about Mountain Development Corporation, that some of the smaller ranchers were talking about banding together to resist the buyouts. If Marcus could get back to town alive, if he could, show people the documents in the metal box, maybe he could turn this from a fight between one man and a corporation into something bigger. But first he had to survive the next 10 minutes. The sound of shifting gravel told him that Crane's men were moving again, trying to flank his position. Marcus risked a quick look around the woodpile and saw 2 gunmen working their way through the trees on his right. In a few more minutes, they'd have him caught in a crossfire. Time to go. Marcus gathered his legs under him and sprinted toward the back of the cabin, where the forest pressed close against the building. Bullets followed him, splintering bark and kicking up dirt, but the range was long and the light was failing. He reached the trees without taking a hit and plunged into the undergrowth. Behind him, he could hear Crane shouting orders, organizing a pursuit. But Marcus had grown up in these mountains, and he knew every game trail and deer path for miles around. More importantly, he knew where he was going. The canyon that held Jeremiah's secret claim was only half a mile away through the forest. And, if the old man's maps were accurate, there was a cave there that would provide shelter until dark. Once night fell, Marcus could work his way back toward town, using routes that Crane's city-bred gunmen would never find. But as he crashed through the underbrush with pursuit close behind, Marcus realized that just escaping wasn't enough. He had to get the documents to someone who could use them, someone with the authority and connections to take on Mountain Development Corporation. The metal box under his coat seemed to grow heavier with each step, weighted not just with paper and ink, but with the lives of everyone in Pine Ridge who had refused to sell to the corporation. Jeremiah's death hadn't been natural causes, and Marcus wouldn't be the last to die if someone didn't stop Crane and the men he worked for. By the time he reached the canyon, full darkness was settling over the mountains like a black blanket. The cave was exactly where Jeremiah's map had indicated, a narrow opening in the canyon wall that led back into the mountain. Marcus squeezed through the entrance and found himself in a natural chamber large enough to stand upright. He lit a match and looked around, then almost dropped the flame in surprise. The cave wasn't empty. Along one wall, stacked like cordwood, were dozens of silver bars, each one stamped with assay marks and serial numbers. Jeremiah hadn't just found the silver deposit. He'd been mining it in secret for years, accumulating a fortune that he'd hidden away like a dragon guarding its hoard. The match burned down to his fingers, and Marcus shook it out, plunging the cave back into darkness. But the image of those silver bars burned in his memory. $3 million, Vincent Crane had said. But looking at the stack of refined metal, Marcus thought the corporation man had been conservative in his estimate. Outside, he could hear voices in the distance, Crane's men spreading out through the forest with lanterns. They were systematic and professional, but they were also working in unfamiliar territory in the dark. Marcus had time to think, time to plan. The metal box contained the proof of Jeremiah's claim and the corporation's involvement in his death. But the real treasure was here in the cave, hundreds of pounds of pure silver that represented years of careful extraction and refinement. It was too much for one man to move, too valuable to leave unguarded. Marcus settled down to wait for dawn, his back against the cave wall and his revolver in his lap. Outside, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Crane's men worked their way deeper into the forest. Eventually, even those faded away, leaving only the night sounds of the mountains, wind in the pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As the hours passed, Marcus found his mind turning over the problem from every angle. He had evidence of a crime, proof of a conspiracy, and access to wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But he was one man against an organization with resources and connections he couldn't match. Even if he made it back to Pine Ridge alive, even if he could convince the local sheriff to listen to his story, what could a small-town lawman do against a corporation with lawyers and politicians in its pocket? The answer came to him as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cave entrance. He couldn't fight Mountain Development Corporation alone, but he didn't have to. Jeremiah's hidden wealth could buy allies, could hire lawyers and investigators, could fund a fight that might finally bring down the men who had killed his great-uncle and terrorized an entire region. But first, he had to get back to town alive, and that meant moving while Crane's men were still searching the wrong part of the forest. Marcus waited until the sun was fully up, then carefully made his way out of the canyon and back toward Pine Ridge. The journey took him most of the morning, moving slowly and carefully, staying off the main trails and using every bit of cover the forest provided. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, he could see smoke rising from several chimneys, the normal signs of a community starting. Another day. But there was nothing normal about the black sedan parked in front of the sheriff's office, or the two men in city suits who stood talking with Sheriff Coleman on the front steps. Marcus ducked behind a storage shed and watched as the conversation continued. He was too far away to hear words, but the body language was clear enough. The city men were giving orders, and the sheriff was listening with the uncomfortable posture of a man who didn't like what he was hearing, but didn't feel he had much choice about it. When the conversation ended, the city men got back in their sedan and drove away, heading north toward the mountain roads. Sheriff Coleman stood on his steps for a long moment, then went back inside his office and closed the door behind him. Marcus waited another 10 minutes, then approached the jail from the back alley. The rear door was unlocked, as it had been. For the 20 years Coleman had been sheriff, in a town like Pine Ridge, crime was usually limited to Saturday night drunks and the occasional dispute over property lines. Coleman looked up from his desk as Marcus slipped through the rear door. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 60s with grey hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from seeing most everything human nature had to offer. He'd been a fair man as long as Marcus had known him, but there were lines around his eyes now that spoke of recent worries. "Marcus," Coleman said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip before he recognized who had entered. "You scared me. What are you doing sneaking in the back way?" "Needed to talk to you private-like," Marcus said, closing the door behind him and throwing the bolt. "And I didn't want to be seen coming in the front." Coleman's expression grew more serious. "This about your inheritance. Because I got to tell you, son, you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Had some federal agents here this morning, asking all kinds of questions about you and that property. Federal agents." Marcus felt his heart sink. If the Mountain Development Corporation had connections that reached all the way to Washington, then the situation was even worse than he'd thought. "That's what they claimed. Showed me badges and credentials, said they were investigating irregularities in land grants and mineral claims in this area." Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with sharp eyes. "Funny thing is, they seem to know an awful lot about your great-uncle's property for federal agents who were just starting their investigation." Marcus pulled the metal box from under his coat and set it on Coleman's desk. "Sheriff, I need you to look at something. And I need you to promise me that no matter what those federal agents told you, you'll hear me out." Coleman looked at the box, then back at Marcus. After a moment, he nodded. "I've known you for 5 years, Marcus. You're not a man who causes trouble without good reason. Let's see what you got." Marcus opened the box and spread the documents across the desk. Coleman put on his reading glasses and examined each paper carefully, his expression growing more grim with each page. When he finished, he sat back and was quiet for a long moment. "Son," he finally said, "do you understand what you're showing me here?" "I think so. Evidence that Jeremiah Dalton was murdered and proof that Mountain Development Corporation has been using fraud and intimidation to steal mineral rights throughout this region." Coleman nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it is. And if these assay reports are accurate, we're talking about one of the richest silver deposits ever found in Montana." He looked up at Marcus. "Those weren't federal agents who came to see me this morning. They were corporate lawyers trying to find out how much I knew and whether I could be bought or scared off." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful, I hope. But Marcus, you're in more danger than you know. These people have killed before, and they'll kill again if they think you're a threat to their operation." Coleman gathered the papers and put them back in the box. "We need to get these documents to someone with enough authority and resources to take on a corporation this size." "Who?" "The state attorney general. Maybe the federal marshal's office in Helena. But first, we need to make sure you live long enough to testify." Coleman stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "How many men did they send after you?" Marcus told him about the confrontation at the cabin, the gun battle, and his night in the cave. Coleman listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. "Vincent Crane," the sheriff muttered when Marcus finished. "I've heard that name before. He's got a reputation for handling the corporation's difficult acquisitions, the kind of problems that can't be solved with money alone." "Sheriff, There's something else. The cave where I hid last night, it's full of silver bars. Jeremiah must have been mining that claim in secret for years. There's enough refined silver there to buy half of Montana. Coleman whistled low. And Crane knows about it. He knows something's there. That's why they're so determined to get the property. Marcus moved away from the window as a black sedan drove slowly down Main Street. The question is, what do we do about it? First thing we do is get you somewhere safe. My deputy's house is outside town, and his wife's a good cook. You can hole up there while I contact the state authorities. Coleman pulled a Winchester rifle from the gun rack behind his desk and checked the action. The second thing we do is gather evidence. If we're going to take down Mountain Development Corporation, we'll need more than just Jeremiah's documents. What kind of evidence? Names of other people they've intimidated, records of suspicious deaths, anything that shows a pattern of criminal activity. Coleman slung the rifle over his shoulder. And we'll need witnesses willing to testify, which won't be easy. People are scared. Marcus thought about the conversations he'd overheard in town, the way people lowered their voices when they talked, about the corporation, the fear in their eyes when anyone mentioned refusing to sell. Jake Morrison at the saloon, he said. He knows things. So does Martha at the post office. If we can convince them that they're safer speaking up than keeping quiet. Maybe. Coleman moved toward the back door, gesturing for Marcus to follow. But first, let's get you out of sight. That sedan's made 3 passes down Main Street in the last 10 minutes, and I don't think they're looking for directions to the general store. They slipped out the back of the jail and made their way through alleys and side streets toward the edge of town. Coleman's deputy, Tom Brennan, lived in a small house a mile outside Pine Ridge, far enough from town to provide some privacy, but close enough to get help if needed. Brennan was a young man, maybe 25, with the kind of steady nerves that made him good at his job. He listened to Coleman's explanation without asking too many questions, then nodded and checked his own weapons. "My Sarah's gone to visit her sister in Billings," Brennan said. "The house is empty except for us. We can keep watch in shifts, make sure nobody approaches without us knowing about it." Coleman left Marcus at the deputy's house with strict instructions to stay inside and away from the windows. The sheriff would return after dark with whatever information he could gather about Mountain Development Corporation's other activities in the area. Marcus spent the afternoon pacing the small house like a caged animal. Every sound outside made him reach for his revolver. Every shadow at the windows looked like it might be one of Crane's men. But as the hours passed and no attack came, he began to think that maybe they were safe, at least for the moment. Tom Brennan proved to be good company, a steady man with a dry sense of humor and a thorough knowledge of local history. Over coffee and sandwiches, he filled in details about the corporation's activities that Marcus hadn't heard before. "Started about 3 years ago," Brennan explained, cleaning his rifle while he talked. "Strangers showing up, making offers on properties that had been in families for generations. Good offers too, more than the land was worth for farming or ranching, but people turned them down. Some did. Mountain folks don't like to be pushed, and there was something about these corporation men that rubbed people wrong. Too smooth, too eager, like they knew something the rest of us didn't." Brennan ran an oiled cloth along the rifle's barrel. "That's when the accidents started happening." Marcus looked up from his coffee. "What kind of accidents?" "Barn fires, mostly. Always happened at night. Always when the family was away from home. Never any proof of arson, but the insurance companies started asking questions." Brennan's face was grim. "Then old Pete Hawkins fell down his own well and drowned. Pete had been working that well for 40 years, knew every stone in it. But suddenly he falls down and breaks his neck." "After he refused to sell?" 2 days after. His widow signed the papers before the funeral was over. Brennan set down his rifle and looked directly at Marcus. "Sheriff Coleman's been keeping track, trying to build a case. but we never had enough evidence to convince anyone outside the county. Until now. As darkness fell, Coleman returned with more bad news. The telephone lines to Helena had been cut, probably sabotaged to prevent communication with state authorities. The road south to Billings was blocked by a construction crew that had appeared overnight, complete with official-looking signs and equipment. And Vincent Crane had been seen in town, asking questions about Marcus's whereabouts and making it clear that he wasn't planning to leave until he got answers. "We're effectively cut off," Coleman said, accepting a cup of coffee from Brennan. "They've isolated Pine Ridge, probably planning to take their time searching for you and the documents." "How long before someone notices the town's out of communication?" Marcus asked. "Could be days, maybe weeks. This isn't exactly the center of the universe, and people expect mountain towns to be out of touch during bad weather." Marcus stood up and began pacing again. "So we're trapped here while they tear the town apart looking for us. How long before they start hurting innocent people to make me come forward?" Coleman's silence was answer enough. "There has to be another way out," Marcus said. "Some route they don't know about, something they can't block." Brennan looked thoughtful. "There's the old mining trail that goes over Copper Ridge. It's not much more than a goat path, and it's dangerous in good weather, but it connects to the road network over in Silver Creek County." "How far?" 20 miles, maybe 25. "But you'd have to do it on foot, and you'd need someone who knows the way." Brennan glanced at Coleman. "I could guide him. I grew up hunting those mountains." Coleman shook his head. "Too risky. If something happens to you, we lose our only backup, and Marcus still might not make it through." "Then what do you suggest?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. Finally, he looked up at Marcus with the expression of a man who'd made a hard decision. "We make our stand here," he said. "Force them to come to us, on our terms, on ground we know. If we're going down, we'll take some of them with us, and maybe that will be enough to convince the state to investigate." Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Coleman was talking about a fight they couldn't win, a last stand against odds that would get them all killed. But looking at the sheriff's weathered face, he realized that some things were worth dying for. "How many men can we count on?" he asked. "In town, maybe 6 or 8 who'll stand up when the chips are down. Jake Morrison for sure. Probably Tom. Wilson from the feed store, maybe a few of the ranchers if we can get word to them." Coleman rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Not many, but mountain men know how to fight. Against professional gunmen with unlimited resources. Against men who think they can ride into our town and take what doesn't belong to them." Coleman's voice was steel. "This is our home, Marcus. Sometimes a man has to make a stand, even when the odds are against him." Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming early this year, and Marcus wondered if any of them would live to see spring. But as he looked at Coleman and Brennan, saw the determination in their faces, he knew that he'd found something in Pine Ridge that he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing it. He'd found a place worth fighting for and people worth dying with. The night passed quietly, with the 3 men taking turns on watch, while the others slept fitfully on bedrolls spread across the deputy's living room floor. Marcus dozed in 2-hour shifts, his dreams filled with images of silver bars and Vincent Crane's cold grey eyes. Dawn brought no relief, only the confirmation that their situation had grown worse overnight. Smoke was rising from the direction of town, and through Coleman's field glasses, they could see that Jake Morrison's saloon was burning. "Message," Coleman said grimly, lowering the glasses. "They're telling us what happens to people who might help you." Marcus felt sick. Jake had been nothing but kind to him, had lent him a horse and asked no questions. Now his business was destroyed because of his association with a man he barely knew. "How many people were in town when it started?" Marcus asked. "Hard to say. Most folks would have been home in bed." Coleman handed the glasses to Brennan. "Take a look, Tom. See if you can spot any activity around the other buildings." Brennan studied the distant town for several minutes. "Looks like they're setting up checkpoints on all the main roads. I count at least a dozen men, maybe more. They're not just looking for Marcus anymore, they're occupying the place." Coleman nodded grimly. "Which means we're out of time for subtle solutions. They've declared war on the whole town." "Then maybe it's time to give them a war," Marcus said quietly. Both lawmen looked at him, hearing something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Marcus was done running, done hiding. Vincent Crane had made this personal when he burned out Jake Morrison, and now it was going to end one way or another. "Tell me about that cave," Coleman said. "The one with the silver bars. Could we get back there without them seeing us? Maybe, if we went around Devil's Canyon. But it would take most of the day, and we'd be exposed crossing the high meadows." Marcus thought about the route, visualizing the terrain. "Why? Because if we're going to make a stand, we might as well do it where the stakes are highest. Let them come to us where the silver is, where they'll have to fight uphill in unfamiliar territory." Brennan was nodding slowly. "And if we can get word to some of the other ranchers, tell them what's really going on, we might have more help than we think." "How?" "The Sanderson place is only 5 miles from here, and old Carl's got 4 sons who can all shoot straight. The Weatherby Ranch is another 3 miles past that. Between the 2 families, that's 8 more guns, and they all know these mountains like the backs of their hands." Coleman considered this. "It's a risk. If Crane's men intercept us trying to reach them, it's a bigger risk if we try to face them alone," Marcus pointed out. "And if we're going to die anyway, we might as well die fighting for something that matters." The decision made, they spent the morning planning their route and dividing their limited supplies. Coleman would ride to the Sanderson and Weatherby ranches, carrying copies of Jeremiah's documents to prove the corporation's crimes. Brennan would guide Marcus back to the cave through the back country, using game trails and hidden valleys to avoid Crane's patrols. If everything went according to plan, they would rendezvous at the Silver Cache by nightfall, with reinforcements and enough firepower to make Crane think twice about a direct assault. If the plan failed, at least they would die knowing they'd tried to do the right thing. As they prepared to leave, Marcus found himself thinking about the twists of fate that had brought him to this point. A week ago, he'd been a broke mountain man with no prospects and no hope. Now he was the heir to a fortune, the key witness in a criminal conspiracy, and quite possibly a dead man walking. But looking at Coleman and Brennan, seeing the resolve in their faces, he realized that he'd also found something else, a purpose worth the risk and friends worth dying for. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he wouldn't face it alone. The wind carried the smell of smoke from town as they mounted their horses and rode out into the grey morning, leaving behind the safety of the deputy's house for the uncertain dangers of the mountains. Behind them, Pine Ridge burned. Ahead lay the cave full of silver and the final confrontation with Vincent Crane. Marcus checked his revolver one more time, making sure the cylinders were fully loaded. In a few hours, he would learn whether Jeremiah's legacy was worth the price in blood that it was going to cost. The ride through Devil's Canyon tested every skill Marcus had learned in 20 years of mountain living. The narrow trail wound between towering granite walls that blocked out the sun, leaving them in perpetual twilight even at midday. Deputy Brennan proved to be as good as his word, leading them through passages that seemed impossible for horses, around boulder fields that looked like the work of angry giants. They stopped only once to rest the animals and eat cold biscuits that Brennan's wife had left behind. The silence between the canyon walls was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere far above. "How much farther?" Marcus asked, checking his pocket watch. They'd been traveling for 4 hours, and the strain was showing on both horses and riders. Another hour, maybe 2. Brennan pointed toward a notch in the canyon wall ahead. "That passage leads to the high meadows. From there, it's a straight shot to your cave." Marcus nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The weight of Jeremiah's documents in his saddlebags seemed to grow heavier with each mile. $3 million in silver waiting in a cave that most people couldn't even find. It was enough wealth to change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in Pine Ridge. The question was whether any of them would live long enough to enjoy it. They emerged from Devil's Canyon into a vast alpine meadow that stretched for miles under the gray Montana sky. Here, above the tree line, the wind had a bite that promised snow before nightfall. The horses picked their way carefully across the uneven ground, their breath steaming in the thin air. Halfway across the meadow, Brennan suddenly raised his hand and reined in his horse. Marcus followed suit, straining his ears for whatever sound had caught the deputy's attention. There it was, the distant rumble of engines, growing closer by the minute. "Motor cars," Brennan said grimly. "More than one coming up the old logging road from the valley." Marcus felt his heart sink. Somehow, Crane had figured out their destination and was moving to cut them off. But as the sound grew clearer, he realized it was coming from the wrong direction. "That's not the Valley Road," he said suddenly. "That's coming from Silver Creek County." Brennan's weathered face broke into the first smile Marcus had seen from him all day. "Sheriff Coleman," he said. "Sounds like he found those reinforcements we were hoping for." They spurred their horses toward the sound, crossing the remaining distance to the cave entrance in minutes rather than the careful hours Marcus had planned. As they rounded a bend in the narrow canyon, they saw 3 vehicles parked near the hidden entrance: Sheriff Coleman's official car, a battered ranch truck, and a newer Ford that Marcus didn't recognize. Coleman was waiting for them with 5 of the men, all armed, and wearing the kind of serious expressions that came from understanding exactly how dangerous their situation had become. Marcus recognized 2 of the Sanderson boys, Carl Jr. and Pete, both of them carrying hunting rifles that looked well-maintained and frequently used. The other 3 were strangers, but their bearing and equipment marked them as professionals. The oldest, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and pale blue eyes, stepped forward as Marcus and Brennan dismounted. "You must be Dalton," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Captain James Mitchell, Montana State Police. Sheriff Coleman has shown me some very interesting documents." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that spoke of a man accustomed to command. "Captain, I hope the sheriff explained the situation." "He did, and I brought some backup." Mitchell gestured to his companions. "Sergeant Hayes and Trooper Williams, both good men in a tight spot. We also picked up the Weatherby boys on the way here." The 2 younger men nodded respectfully. Marcus could see the family resemblance to the Sandersons, the same weathered faces and steady hands that came from lives spent working hard in the country. "How did you get past Crane's roadblocks?" Marcus asked. Mitchell's smile was thin and gold. "Turned out they weren't as official as they claimed. When we showed up with proper state authority and started asking for permits and documentation, they decided to relocate their construction project." Coleman stepped forward, his face grave despite the good news. "Marcus, we need to see this silver cache of yours. If it's as valuable as those assay reports claim, we're going to need every advantage we can get." Marcus led the group to the cave entrance, squeezing through the narrow opening into the natural chamber beyond. He struck a match and lit one of the oil lamps he'd found during his previous visit, filling the cave with golden light that reflected off the stacked silver bars like fallen stars. The silence that followed was profound. Even the state troopers, men who had seen their share of criminal enterprises, stood speechless at the sight of so much refined precious metal in one place. "Sweet Jesus," Carl Jr. whispered. "That's more silver than I've seen in my entire life." Captain Mitchell moved closer to examine the bars, noting the assay marks and serial numbers stamped into each one. "This is professional work," he said. Whoever refined this ore knew what they were doing. These bars would be accepted by any bank or precious metals dealer in the country. How much do you think it's worth? One of the Weatherby boys asked. Mitchell did quick calculations in his head. At current silver prices, somewhere between $2 and $3 million, maybe more depending on the purity. The figure hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, too large to fully comprehend. Marcus had grown up poor, had spent his entire adult life scraping by on whatever the mountains provided. The idea that he was now technically one of the richest men in Montana was almost impossible to accept. The question, Sheriff Coleman said quietly, is what we do with it now. We can't exactly load it in our trucks and drive away. There's too much, and Crane's men will be watching every road out of the county. We don't take it anywhere, Marcus said. We make them come to us. Mitchell looked thoughtful. Defensive position, high ground, limited approaches, difficult terrain. And for attackers, it could work if we had enough men and ammunition. How many men does Crane have? Sergeant Hayes asked. We counted at least a dozen in town this morning, Brennan replied. Could be more by now. Odds of 2 to 1, maybe worse. Mitchell studied the cave entrance, noting the natural choke point that would force attackers to approach in single file. But we'd have the advantage of position, and they'd be fighting uphill in unfamiliar territory. There's something else, Marcus said. He pulled out Jeremiah's maps, spreading them on a flat boulder near the lamp. My great-uncle marked other sites in these mountains, smaller caches, emergency supplies, maybe even weapons. The group gathered around the maps, studying. Jeremiah's careful notations. The old hermit had been thorough in his preparations, marking dozens of locations throughout the high country with symbols that were beginning to make sense to Marcus. This symbol here, he said, pointing to a marking about 2 miles from there. Current location. It's repeated at 6 different sites, all at roughly the same elevation. Could be supply caches. Worth checking, Mitchell agreed. If your great-uncle was as paranoid as he seems, he might have prepared for exactly this kind of situation. They were divided into 3 teams. Mitchell and Hayes would investigate the nearest marked site, while Coleman and the Sanderson boys checked another location to the south. Marcus would remain at the cave with Brennan and the Weatherby brothers, preparing defensive positions and keeping watch for any sign of Crane's approach. As the search parties departed, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since the confrontation at the cabin. The cave was quiet except for the distant sound of wind through the canyon walls, and the silver bars gleamed in the lamplight like a dragon's hoard from some ancient fairy tale. A week ago, he'd been a broke mountain man with no prospects and no future. Now he owned more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he might not live to see another sunset. The irony wasn't lost on him. Brennan approached, carrying his rifle and wearing the serious expression of a man preparing for war. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Go ahead. If we get out of this alive, what are your plans for all that silver? Marcus considered the question. It was one he'd been avoiding, partly because he wasn't sure they'd survive to face the problem, and partly because the answer scared him. Honestly, I don't know. A week ago, the most money I'd ever had at one time was maybe $50. He gestured at the silver bars. This is beyond anything I know how to handle. But you've got some ideas. Marcus nodded slowly. Jeremiah didn't mind this silver just to get rich. He hid it away, kept it secret for years. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, the right cause. He looked directly at Brennan. Mountain Development Corporation has been terrorizing this whole region, stealing land and murdering people who won't sell. If we can stop them, if we can use this wealth to fight back, you're talking about war. I'm talking about justice. Marcus's voice was quiet, but firm. They killed Jeremiah because he wouldn't sell. They burned out Jake Morrison because he helped me. How many more people have to die before someone stands up to them? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. My family's been in this county for 3 generations. My grandfather homesteaded here when it was still territory. I'll be damned if I let some corporation drive us out now. The sound of returning vehicles interrupted their conversation. Mitchell and his team had returned from their reconnaissance, and from the excited voices echoing through the canyon, they'd found something significant. Supply cache, Mitchell announced as he entered the cave. Your great-uncle was better prepared than we thought. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, even dynamite. He gestured for Hayes to bring in a wooden crate that proved to contain a dozen Winchester rifles, still packed in factory grease. Another crate held several thousand rounds of ammunition, and a third contained enough medical supplies to outfit a field hospital. There's more, Hayes added. Food supplies, camping gear, even a radio transmitter. Old, but it looks functional. Marcus stared at the equipment, beginning to understand the scope of Jeremiah's preparations. This wasn't the work of a paranoid hermit. This was a man who had seen trouble coming and prepared for war. How many other sites are marked on the maps? Mitchell asked. Marcus counted quickly. 7 more with the same symbol scattered throughout. The high country. If they're all stocked like this one, then your great-uncle was planning for a siege. Mitchell's expression was grim. The question is, did he know specifically about Mountain Development Corporation, or was he just preparing for general trouble? The answer came from an unexpected source. At the bottom of the weapons crate, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a journal, bound in black leather. Marcus opened it carefully, revealing pages of Jeremiah's careful handwriting interspersed with newspaper clippings and official documents. The entries went back 5 years, starting with the first appearance of corporate land buyers in the region. Jeremiah had tracked their activities with the methodical patience of a man who understood the value of information. Names, dates, properties acquired, methods used. It was all recorded in meticulous detail. Listen to this, Marcus said, reading, from an entry dated 6 months before Jeremiah's death. The crane visited again today, more persistent than before. Offered $100,000 for the claim, said it was their final offer, told him I'd rather see it at the bottom of the ocean than in their hands. He smiled when he left, but his eyes were cold as winter. Need to accelerate preparations. So he knew. They were planning to kill him, Coleman said quietly. Marcus flipped through more pages, finding entries that detailed corporate activities throughout the region. The pattern was clear: approach, offer, pressure, and if all else failed, elimination. Jeremiah had documented at least a dozen suspicious deaths, all of people who had refused to sell to Mountain Development Corporation. This is evidence, Mitchell said. More than enough to bring federal charges against the entire organization. If we live long enough to present it, Brennan pointed out. As if summoned by his words, the sound of engines echoed through the canyon. But this time, the vehicles were coming from the direction of Pine Ridge, and there were a lot of them. Mitchell moved to the cave entrance, using field glasses to study the approaching convoy. 6 vehicles, maybe 7. Looks like they brought everything they had. Marcus joined him, counting the black sedans and trucks that were winding their way up the narrow canyon road. Through the glasses, he could see men with rifles taking positions along the convoy's route, preparing for a coordinated assault. How long do we have? Coleman asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30, Mitchell replied. Depends on how carefully they approach. The group sprang into action with the efficiency of men who had been preparing for this moment all day. The Winchester rifles were distributed and loaded. Defensive positions were established behind natural rock formations, and the precious documents were secured in a place where they might survive, even if none of the defenders did. As they worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been nobody special, just another mountain man scratching out a living in the high country. Now he was at the center of a war that would determine the future of an entire region. But looking at the men around him, Sheriff Coleman with his weathered face and steady hands, Deputy Brennan checking his rifle with professional competence, Captain Mitchell coordinating defensive positions like the veteran soldier he clearly was, Marcus realized that he wasn't fighting alone. These men had chosen to stand with him not because of the silver in the cave, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their right to live free from the kind of corporate tyranny that Mountain Development Corporation represented. The sound of engines grew closer, and Marcus could hear voices shouting orders in the distance. Vincent Crane had arrived with his army, ready to finish what he'd started at the cabin. But this time, Marcus was ready for him. This time, he had allies, weapons, and a fortress carved out of living rock. Most importantly, he had a cause worth fighting for, and the evidence to prove that their cause was just. The battle for the Silver Cave was about to begin, and with it, the fight for the soul of the Montana mountains would be decided once and for all. Marcus checked his rifle one final time and took his position behind the defensive barricade, ready to make his stand. The first shot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Marcus ducked instinctively as the bullet sparked off granite, inches from his head, sending stone fragments flying. From his position behind a natural rock formation at the cave entrance, he could see muzzle flashes winking among the boulders below. "They're testing our range," Captain Mitchell called from across the defensive perimeter. "Don't waste ammunition on wild shots." Vincent Crane's voice echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by a battery-powered megaphone. "Dalton, you're surrounded and outnumbered. Send down the documents, and we'll let the others walk away alive." Marcus cupped his hands around his mouth. "Come up and get them yourself, Crane." The response was immediate. A concentrated volley of rifle fire that forced all the defenders to keep their heads down. When the shooting stopped, Marcus could hear Crane's men moving closer, using the covering fire to advance up the steep canyon. "Walls. Movement on the south ridge," Sergeant Hayes reported, his field glasses trained on a line of rocks about 300 yards away. "At least 4 men working their way around to flank us." Sheriff Coleman sighted down his Winchester. "I can see them. Pete, take your brother and cover that approach. Don't let them get above us." The Sanderson boys moved with the silent efficiency of men who had spent their lives hunting in these mountains. Within minutes, they had established a crossfire position that commanded the entire south slope. But Crane had planned this assault carefully. As the defenders focused on the flanking movement, a second team began climbing the north wall of the canyon. These men moved like professionals, using ropes and climbing gear to scale rock faces that most people would consider impossible. "They're not just gunmen," Mitchell observed grimly. "Some of these boys have military training." Marcus watched the climbers through his rifle scope, noting their coordinated movements and professional equipment. Mountain Development Corporation had resources that went far beyond what he'd imagined. This wasn't just a land grab. It was a military operation disguised as a business venture. "How many rounds do we have?" he asked Brennan. The deputy made quick calculations. "Maybe 200 rifle cartridges, plus whatever's in our sidearms. Enough for a good fight, but not a long one." A new sound echoed through the canyon, the rhythmic chop of rotor blades. Marcus looked up to see a helicopter circling overhead, staying just out of rifle range while its occupants studied the defensive positions below. "Now what?" Coleman muttered. The helicopter made several passes, then moved off toward the valley, but 15 minutes later it returned, and this time it wasn't alone. A second aircraft appeared, this one larger and designed for cargo transport. "They're bringing in reinforcements," Mitchell said, "or heavy weapons. Either way, we're about to have more company than we can handle." The sound of the helicopters masked the approach of Crane's ground forces. By the time Marcus realized how close they'd gotten, rifle fire was crackling from 3 different directions. The defenders found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, pinned down behind inadequate cover while bullets chewed up the granite around them. "We can't hold this position," Hayes shouted over the gunfire. "They'll have us surrounded in another." 10 minutes. "Fall back to the cave," Mitchell ordered. "At least they will only have to cover one approach." The retreat was chaotic and dangerous. The Weatherby brothers provided covering fire while the others moved in pairs toward the narrow cave entrance. One of the boys, Danny Weatherby, cried out and stumbled as a bullet caught him in the shoulder, but his brother hauled him to safety before the wound could prove fatal. Inside the cave, the defenders found themselves in a much stronger position, but facing a new problem. The narrow entrance was easy to defend, but it also meant they were trapped. If Crane's men could seal the opening or use explosives, the fight would be over quickly. "Medical kit," Mitchell called, kneeling beside Danny Weatherby. The young rancher was conscious but pale, blood seeping through his shirt where the bullet had torn through muscle and sinew. Marcus helped bandage the wound while listening to the sounds outside. Crane's men were regrouping, probably planning their next move. The helicopter sounds suggested they now had enough firepower to blast the defenders out of their rocky fortress. "There has to be another way out of here," Coleman said, studying the back of the cave. "Your great-uncle was too smart to let himself get trapped." Marcus thought about Jeremiah's journal, remembering entries about escape routes and contingency plans. The old hermit had spent years preparing for exactly this situation. There had to be something they were missing. He moved deeper into the cave, following a narrow passage that led back into the mountain. The space was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber that had been carved out by centuries of underground water flow. In the dim light of his oil lamp, Marcus could see that Jeremiah had been here before. Supplies were stacked against the walls, food, water, blankets, and more weapons. But most importantly, there was another passage leading upward toward what might be a second entrance to the cave system. "Mitchell," he called back to the main chamber, "I found something." The state police captain squeezed through the narrow opening, followed by Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Brennan. When they saw the supplies and the upward passage, their expressions shifted from desperation to hope. "Does that lead outside?" Coleman asked. Marcus studied Jeremiah's hand-drawn map of the cave system. "Looks like it. Opens up somewhere on the ridge above us, maybe half a mile from here." "That could be our way out," Mitchell said, "but we'd have to leave the silver behind." "No." Marcus's voice was firm. "That silver is the only leverage we have against Mountain Development Corporation. Without it, we're just fugitives with a story nobody will believe." "Then what do you suggest?" Marcus studied the map more carefully, tracing the various passages with his finger. "We split up. Some of us take the documents and escape through the upper passage. The others stay here and hold the cave as long as possible. Drawing lots for who stays and who goes?" Brennan asked quietly. "No lots." Marcus looked each man in the eye. "Mitchell and his troopers need to get those documents to federal authorities. That's the only way this ends, without more bloodshed. The rest of us stay and buy them time." Mitchell started to object, but Marcus cut him off. "This is my fight. Captain, my inheritance, my responsibility. Besides, you're the only one here with enough authority to make the federal government listen." Outside, Vincent Crane's voice boomed through the megaphone again. "Final warning, Dalton. Come out now, or we're coming in after you." "Go!" Marcus told Mitchell. "Take Hayes and Williams and get those documents to Helena. Make sure the world knows what Mountain Development Corporation really is." The state police captain clasped Marcus's shoulder briefly, then gathered the precious papers and led his men toward the escape passage. The sound of their boots faded into the depths of the mountain, leaving Marcus with Coleman, Brennan, and the wounded Weatherby brothers. "Reckon we can hold them off?" Coleman asked, checking his ammunition. Marcus looked around the cave at the silver bars that had started this whole mess, then at the men who had chosen to stand with him. "Long enough," he said simply. The assault began at noon, announced by the deafening roar of dynamite against the cave entrance. The explosion brought down part of the ceiling, filling the air with dust and debris, but the main structure held. When the smoke cleared, Crane's men came charging through the narrow opening like demons from hell. The defenders were ready for them. Marcus's first shot dropped the lead attacker before he'd taken 3 steps into the cave. Coleman's Winchester bucked twice, and 2 more corporate gunmen fell. But for every man they stopped, 2 more appeared to take his place. The fight was brutal and close quarters, the kind of combat that separated the desperate from the determined. Marcus found himself face to face with a scarred gunman wielding a sawed-off shotgun, dodging the blast and putting 2 bullets center mass before the man could reload. Brennan fought like a wildcat, using the rocky terrain to his advantage, appearing from behind cover to take careful shots before disappearing again. The Weatherby brothers, despite Danny's wound, proved they hadn't spent their lives hunting just for sport, but ammunition was running low, and Crane seemed to have an endless supply of men. Marcus counted the shots he had left, 4 rounds in. His revolver, maybe a dozen rifle cartridges, not enough to hold out much longer. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the whine of heavy machinery being dragged up the canyon. Through the smoke and gunfire, he could see Crane's men positioning what looked like a small cannon at the cave entrance. "Artillery," Coleman said grimly. "They're done playing games." Marcus looked around at his remaining ammunition, at the wounded, men depending on him, at the fortune in silver that represented both his inheritance and his curse. In a few minutes, that cannon would turn their rocky fortress into a tomb. But as he prepared to make his final stand, Marcus heard something else. The distant sound of automobile engines coming fast up the canyon road. A lot of engines approaching from the direction of town. Through the chaos of battle, he caught a glimpse of dust clouds rising beyond the canyon entrance. Someone was coming, and from the sound of it, they were coming in force. The question was whether help would arrive in time, or whether Vincent Crane would finish his bloody work before anyone could intervene. Marcus checked his revolver one more time and prepared to find out. The cannon's first blast tore a chunk out of the cave entrance the size of a wagon wheel. Rock fragments whistled through the air like shrapnel, and the concussion left Marcus's ears ringing. Through the settling dust, he could see Vincent Crane directing his men to reload the artillery piece, his face lit with savage satisfaction. "That was just to get our attention," Crane shouted through his megaphone. "The next one brings down the whole entrance. Last chance to surrender, Dalton." Marcus wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and checked his remaining ammunition. 3 bullets in his revolver, maybe 8 rifle cartridges scattered among the defenders. Against Crane's army and their artillery, it might as well have been nothing, but the sound of approaching engines was getting closer, and through the smoke and chaos, Marcus caught glimpses of vehicles racing up the canyon road. Whoever was coming was pushing their machines hard, taking risks on the narrow mountain trail that suggested desperate urgency. "Danny, how's that shoulder?" Marcus called to the wounded Weatherby boy. "Still attached," Danny replied through gritted teeth, though his face was pale from blood loss. "I can still shoot if you need me to." Sheriff Coleman had positioned himself behind a fallen boulder near the cave mouth, his Winchester trained on the artillery crew. "Can't get a clean shot from here," he muttered. "Too much cover." Deputy Brennan appeared at Marcus's elbow, his uniform torn and dusty from the fight. "Marcus, there's something you need to see. Back in the supply chamber." Reluctantly leaving his position, Marcus followed Brennan deeper into the cave system. In the chamber where Jeremiah had stored his emergency supplies, Brennan pointed to a wooden crate that had been hidden behind the silver bars. "Dynamite," Brennan said simply. "Your great-uncle was planning for more than just a siege." Marcus stared at the crate of explosives, understanding immediately what Jeremiah had intended. If the cave couldn't be held, it could collapse, burying the silver and denying it to Mountain Development Corporation forever, but it would also bury anyone still inside. "How much?" Marcus asked. "Enough to bring down half the mountain if we set it right." Brennan's face was grim. "But there's no way to set a fuse long enough to get clear. Someone would have to stay behind." The sound of the cannon being repositioned echoed through the cave, followed by Crane's voice again. 30 seconds, Dalton. Then we're coming in." Marcus made his decision. "Get back to the entrance. Hold them off as long as you can." "What are you going to do?" What Jeremiah would have wanted. Marcus began examining the dynamite, looking for fuses and detonators. "That silver doesn't belong to the Mountain Development Corporation, and they're not getting it." Brennan grabbed his arm. "Marcus, there has to be another way." "There is. Those engines coming up the canyon. Whoever that is might be able to finish what we started. But only if Crane doesn't get his hands on the evidence first." The deputy studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "How long do you need?" 5 minutes to set the charges properly. Maybe 10 to rig a delay that might give me a chance to get clear. "You'll have it." Brennan gripped his shoulder briefly, then headed back toward the cave entrance. Marcus worked with the methodical precision of a man who understood that mistakes meant death. Jeremiah's dynamite was old, but still stable. The fuses were dry and reliable. He placed charges at strategic points in the cave system, locations where the explosions would bring down the maximum amount of rock with the minimum amount of explosive. But as he worked, the sounds of battle outside grew more intense. The approaching vehicles had arrived, and from the chaos of gunfire and shouting, it seemed like a full-scale war had erupted in the canyon. Through a crack in the cave wall, Marcus caught glimpses of the newcomers. They weren't more of Crane's men. These were local people, ranchers and townspeople armed with hunting rifles and shotguns. Someone had rallied Pine Ridge's citizens to fight back against the Mountain Development Corporation. Leading them was a figure Marcus recognized with a surge of hope. Jake Morrison, the saloon keeper whose business had been burned out the night before. The older man carried a double-barreled shotgun and wore an expression of cold fury that spoke of personal grievances to settle. "Morrison!" Marcus shouted through the crack. "Get your people to cover! They've got artillery!" Jake spotted him and waved acknowledgement, then began organizing the townspeople into defensive positions among the canyon rocks. But even with reinforcements, they were still outnumbered by Crane's professional gunmen. The cannon roared again, this time aimed not at the cave, but at the approaching citizens. The shell exploded among a group of rocks where several ranchers had taken cover, and Marcus heard screams of pain and terror. That decided it. Marcus lit the first fuse, a long one that would give him maybe 3 minutes to get clear, then the second and the third. The cave began to fill with the acrid smell of burning powder as the fuses hissed their way toward the dynamite charges. But as he moved toward the escape passage that Captain Mitchell had taken hours earlier, a new sound made him freeze. The voice of a child crying for help somewhere in the main chamber. Marcus ran back through the narrow passage, his heart pounding. In the confusion of the battle, he'd forgotten about the possibility of civilian casualties among the reinforcements. But there, huddled behind a stack of silver bars, was a girl of maybe 12 years old, tears streaming down her dirty face. "Please, mister," she sobbed. "My papa sent me to find you. He said you'd help." Marcus knelt beside her, his mind racing. The fuses were burning, maybe 2 minutes left before the charges blew, but he couldn't leave a child to die, not even to deny Crane. "His victory. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lucy Morrison. Jake's my grandfather. He said to tell you the Federals are coming, but they won't get here in time. Jake Morrison's granddaughter." The old saloon keeper had risked everything to mount this rescue, including bringing his own family into danger. Marcus made another, snap decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. He scooped up Lucy and ran for the escape passage, abandoning his carefully placed charges with barely a minute left on the fuses. The narrow tunnel was barely wide enough for an adult man, let alone one carrying a frightened child, but desperation gave him strength. Behind them, the main cave erupted in a chaos of gunfire as Crane's men finally broke through the weakened entrance. Marcus could hear Sheriff Coleman's Winchester answering, then Deputy Brennan's voice shouting defiance. Good men making their last stand while he fled through the mountain's bowels with a child who should never have been in danger. The escape passage angled sharply upward, following a natural fault in the rock. Marcus's lungs burned as he climbed, Lucy's weight making every step a struggle. Below, the gunfire was becoming sporadic. His friends were running out of ammunition, running out of time. Then the mountain shook. The first explosion was muffled by tons of rock, but Marcus felt it in his bones. One of his charges had detonated, probably triggered by stray bullets or the heat from the battle. A second blast followed, then a third, each one bringing down more of the cave system. "The silver," Lucy whispered, apparently understanding more than her age would suggest. "It's gone, isn't it?" "Yes," Marcus said simply. "It's gone." They emerged from the escape passage onto a narrow ledge high above the canyon, hidden by pine trees and scrub brush. From this vantage point, Marcus could see the full scope of the battle below. Jake Morrison's citizen army had taken heavy casualties, but was holding its ground, using the terrain and their superior knowledge of the mountains to offset Crane's professional advantages. But the cave entrance had collapsed entirely, tons of granite sealing away not just the silver, but anyone who had been inside when the charges blew. Marcus scanned the battlefield desperately, looking for any sign that his friends had escaped. There, Sheriff Coleman's distinctive hat behind a boulder near the canyon wall. The man was wounded, clutching his left arm, but he was alive and still fighting. Deputy Brennan appeared a moment later, dragging one of the Weatherby brothers to safety. But the cost had been terrible. Bodies in both uniforms and civilian clothes lay scattered across the canyon floor. The artillery piece was silent, its crew apparently killed in the citizen counterattack. But Crane still had enough men to win if the battle continued much longer. "Look," Lucy said, pointing toward the canyon mouth. A convoy of official vehicles was racing up the road. Black sedans with federal license plates, followed by military trucks carrying uniformed soldiers. Captain Mitchell had reached Helena and convinced the authorities to intervene, but the timing was going to be desperately close. Vincent Crane must have seen them too, because he suddenly appeared from behind cover, shouting orders to his surviving men. Instead of continuing the fight, they were preparing to retreat, probably hoping to disappear into the wilderness before the federal forces could surround them. But Jake Morrison had other ideas. The old saloon keeper rose from his position with the fury of a man who had lost everything to corporate greed. His shotgun boomed twice, dropping two of Crane's men who were trying to reach their vehicles. "This is for my saloon," Jake roared, advancing with grim determination. "And for every honest man you bastards have murdered." Other townspeople took up the cry, advancing from their positions despite their casualties and exhaustion. They had found something worth fighting for, something more valuable than silver or profit, the right to live free from fear in their own homes. Crane tried to rally his remaining men, but the combination of citizen fury and approaching federal forces was too much. The corporate gunmen broke and ran, abandoning their equipment and wounded in their haste to escape. But Crane himself wasn't finished. Marcus watched in horror as the corporation man produced a military radio and began speaking urgently into the handset. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't a surrender. The answer came minutes later in the form of helicopter gunships appearing over the canyon rim. These weren't the transport helicopters from earlier. These were military aircraft armed with rockets and machine guns. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, holding Lucy closer. "He's got air support." The federal convoy was still minutes away from the canyon when the gunships opened fire. Rockets exploded among the townspeople's positions, and machine gun fire raked the rocky terrain. Jake Morrison's brave citizens found themselves caught in the open, facing weapons they had no way to fight. Marcus watched helplessly as friends and neighbors were cut down by professionally delivered death from above. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre, and there was nothing he could do to stop it from his hiding place on the mountainside. But then Lucy Morrison did something that changed everything. The 12-year-old girl stood up on the narrow ledge, completely exposed to the aircraft above, and began waving a white cloth torn from her dress. "Stop!" she screamed with all the power her young lungs could muster. "There are children here! Stop shooting!" One of the helicopter pilots must have seen her, because the firing slackened and stopped. For a moment, an eerie quiet fell over the canyon, broken only by the sound of rotor blades and the groans of wounded men. Then the federal convoy arrived. Military vehicles surrounded the canyon entrance, while uniformed soldiers took positions throughout the battlefield. A loudspeaker crackled to life, and Marcus heard Captain Mitchell's voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is Captain Mitchell, Montana State Police, acting on federal authority. All corporate personnel will lay down their weapons immediately and submit to arrest. Any continued resistance will be met with deadly force." The helicopter gunships circled uncertainly, their pilots apparently unsure whether to continue the new attack against federal forces. Vincent Crane's voice could be heard shouting conflicting orders, but his authority was rapidly evaporating as federal agents surrounded his position. One by one, the surviving corporate gunmen began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. The massacre was over, but the cost had been terrible. Marcus counted at least a dozen bodies scattered across the canyon floor, good people who had died trying to protect their community from corporate tyranny. As federal agents began securing the scene and treating the wounded, Marcus helped Lucy down from their hiding place. The silver was gone, buried under tons of rock that would take months to excavate. Jeremiah's fortune had been destroyed rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. But looking at the survivors gathering in the canyon below, Sheriff Coleman having his arm treated by a medic, Deputy Brennan helping coordinate the federal investigation, Jake Morrison embracing his granddaughter with tears in his eyes, Marcus realized that some victories were worth more than money. Mountain Development Corporation's reign of terror in the Montana mountains was finally over. The cost had been higher than anyone wanted to pay, but justice had been served, and the people of Pine Ridge were free. Marcus Dalton had inherited a fortune and lost it in the same week. But he had gained something more valuable, a community, a purpose, and the knowledge that when good people stood together, even the most powerful enemies could be defeated. 3 days after the battle at Silver Canyon, Marcus sat in the Pine Ridge Community Hall, watching federal agents sort through boxes of evidence that painted a picture of corporate corruption stretching across half the western United States. The hall had been hastily converted into a field office, with tables covered in documents, maps, and photographs that told the story of Mountain Development Corporation's criminal enterprise. Agent Sarah Chen, the lead federal investigator, looked up from a stack of Jeremiah's journals. "Mr. Dalton, your great-uncle was remarkably thorough. These records go back 5 years and document systematic fraud, intimidation, and murder across 4 states. Marcus nodded, his arm still in a sling, from a bullet graze he'd taken during the final assault. Jeremiah was a careful man. He knew someone would try to steal what he'd found. About that, Chen continued, consulting her notes, Our geological team finished their preliminary survey of the collapsed cave this morning. Based on the mineral samples they recovered and your great-uncle's assay reports, we estimate the destroyed silver deposit was worth approximately $4 million. The figure hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. $4 million, turned to rubble and buried under tons of granite to keep it from Vincent Crane's hands. Marcus felt a familiar pang of loss, but it was tempered by something else, a deep certainty that he'd made the right choice. "Any chance of recovering it?" asked Sheriff Coleman from his position near the window. His left arm was in a cast, but he'd insisted on staying involved in the investigation. Agent Chen shook her head. The explosions destabilized that entire section of the mountain. It would take years and millions of dollars to excavate safely, assuming the deposit is even intact. Frankly, it's not worth the risk. Jake Morrison, who had been quietly listening from the back of the room, stepped forward. His face still bore the cuts and bruises from the canyon battle, but his eyes held a satisfaction that went deeper than any physical healing. "Seems to me Marcus got exactly what he needed from that silver," Jake said. "It brought down the bastards who were terrorizing this county. That's worth more than any amount of money." Other voices around the room murmured, "Agreement." In the past 3 days, as the full scope of Mountain Development Corporation's crimes had been revealed, Marcus had found himself regarded as something approaching a local hero. People who had barely acknowledged his existence a week ago now stopped him on the street to shake his hand and thank him for his courage. But Marcus knew the truth was more complicated than the growing legend. He hadn't set out to be anyone's savior. He'd simply been a desperate man, trying to survive. The heroism, if it existed at all, belonged to people like Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Brennan, who had risked their lives to protect a community they'd sworn to serve. Agent Chen pulled out a new folder, this one marked with federal classification stamps. "There's something else you need to know, Mr. Dalton. Vincent Crane didn't act alone, and Mountain Development Corporation was just the tip of the iceberg." She spread out a series of photographs and organizational charts that showed connections between the corporation and a network of shell companies, corrupt officials, and criminal enterprises that stretched from Montana to California. "We're calling it Operation Silverweb," Chen explained. "A systematic effort to acquire mineral rights across the western states through fraud, intimidation, and murder. Your great-uncle's silver claim was just one target among dozens." Marcus studied the charts, seeing names and faces that meant nothing to him, but understanding the implications. "How many people died for this?" "We've documented at least 30 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, all involving people who refused to sell mineral rights to corporations connected to the network." Chen's voice was grim. "There are probably more that we haven't uncovered yet." Deputy Brennan, who had been taking notes throughout the briefing, looked up from his notebook. "What about the helicopter attack? That was military hardware. Did Crane get access to gunships?" "That's where things get really interesting," Chen replied. She pulled out another set of documents, these bearing Department of Defense letterhead. Those helicopters were supposed to have been decommissioned and scrapped 2 years ago. Instead, they were sold to a private military contractor with connections to the same financial network that funded Mountain Development Corporation. "Sheriff," Coleman whistled low, "so we weren't just fighting a corporation, we were fighting a private army." "Essentially, yes. The good news is that your battle here exposed the entire operation. Federal raids in 6 states yesterday netted over 200 arrests, including several high-ranking government officials and military contractors." The room fell silent as people absorbed the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Marcus found himself thinking about all the families who had lost loved ones to this conspiracy, all the communities that had been terrorized by corporate greed, disguised as legitimate business. Lucy Morrison, who had been sitting quietly beside her grandfather throughout the briefing, suddenly spoke up. What happens to all the land they stole? Do the families get it back? Agent Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Marcus had seen from her. That's actually one of the better outcomes from this investigation. Federal law allows us to void contracts obtained through fraud and intimidation. Every family that was forced to sell to Mountain Development Corporation will have their property rights restored. A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. For many of them, this meant the return of land that had been in their families for generations. The Morrison family would get back not just Jake's saloon, but the ranch that had been their home for 60 years before corporate pressure forced them to sell. But as the celebration continued around him, Marcus felt a deep emptiness where the excitement should have been. The silver was gone, his great-uncle's fortune destroyed. He was back to being a broken mountain man with no prospects and no future, except now he was a broken mountain man with a target on his back from whatever remained of the criminal network. As if reading his thoughts, Agent Chen approached him, privately, as the meeting began to break up. "Mr. Dalton, I need to discuss something with you in private." They stepped outside onto the community hall's front porch, where the late afternoon sun painted the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and purple. Pine Ridge looked peaceful in the fading light, but Marcus knew that appearance was deceptive. There would be revenge attempts, retaliation from the surviving members of the criminal network. "You're worried about your safety," Chen said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "A lot of powerful people lost money when that cave collapsed. Some of them are still out there. That's why I wanted to speak with you privately." Chen pulled out an official-looking document. "The federal government has a witness protection program, Mr. Dalton. New identity, new location, financial support, while you establish a new life somewhere safe." Marcus took the document, but didn't open it. "What's the catch?" "No catch, exactly. But you'd have to leave Pine Ridge permanently. No contact with anyone here, no returning even for visits. As far as this community is concerned, Marcus Dalton would simply disappear." The thought of leaving felt like another death. In the past week, he'd found something he'd been searching for his entire adult life. A place where he belonged, people who valued him for who he was, rather than what he owned. The idea of walking away from that felt like abandoning everything that mattered. "How long do I have to decide?" "Take your time." "But Mr. Dalton," Chen's voice grew serious, "these people don't forget, and they don't forgive. Vincent Crane was captured, but he was middle management. The real power behind Operation Silverweb is still out there, and they're going to want revenge for the money they lost." After Agent Chen left, Marcus walked slowly through the streets of Pine Ridge, seeing the town with new eyes. Every building, every familiar face represented something he'd never had before. Community, belonging, purpose. The old Marcus would have taken the witness protection offer without hesitation, disappearing into anonymity to preserve his own safety. But the old Marcus wouldn't have stayed in a collapsing cave to save a child's life. The old Marcus wouldn't have risked everything to expose a criminal conspiracy. Something fundamental had changed in him during the past week, something that couldn't be undone by fear or practical considerations. He found himself at the ruins of Jake Morrison's saloon, where cleanup crews were clearing away the debris from Crane's arson attack. Jake himself was there, directing the work with the energy of a man half his age. "Planning to rebuild?" Marcus asked. Jake looked up, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Already got the lumber on order. Should have her back up and running within a month." He paused in his work, studying Marcus's expression. "You look like a man with something heavy on his mind." Marcus told him about Agent Chen's offer, about the Witness Protection Program, and the need to leave Pine Ridge forever. Jake listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as he absorbed the implications. When Marcus finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains that surrounded their small town. Finally, he spoke. You know what I learned in 40 years of running a saloon? Sometimes a man's got to choose between being safe and being alive. Safe keeps your body breathing, but being alive makes your soul worth preserving. And if they come for me, if staying here puts other people in danger—" Jake's smile was grim, but determined. "Then they'll find out that mountain folks don't abandon their friends. You stood with us when we needed you, Marcus. Now we'll stand with you." That evening, the community held an impromptu gathering at the rebuilt schoolhouse. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had produced a jug of what was certainly not legal whiskey. As the night wore on and the music played, Marcus found himself surrounded by people who had become more than neighbors. They had become family. Sheriff Coleman, despite his broken arm, managed to play a few tunes on his harmonica. Deputy Brennan danced with his wife, who had returned from Billings as soon as she heard about the battle. The Weatherby and Sanderson families shared stories and laughter, bonding over their shared ordeal. But it was Lucy Morrison who provided the evening's most memorable moment. The 12-year-old girl who had shown such courage during the helicopter attack approached Marcus with a small wrapped package. "Grandpa Jake says you're thinking about leaving," she said, her young face serious. Beyond her years, Marcus knelt to her level. "It might be safer for everyone if I did." Lucy shook her head firmly. "Heroes don't run away, and you're a hero now whether you like it or not." She handed him the package, which proved to contain a small silver locket that had obviously been in her family for generations. Inside was a photograph of a young woman who bore a strong resemblance to Lucy herself. "That was my grandma," Lucy explained. "She died before I was born, but Grandpa Jake says she would have liked you. Says you've got the same stubborn streak." "She did, always doing what's right, even when it's hard." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Lucy, I can't accept this. It's too valuable." "It's not about money," the girl said, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who have seen too much too young. "It's about remembering that you've got family here. Real family. The kind that doesn't run away when things get dangerous." Later that night, as the gathering wound down and people began heading home, Marcus sat on the schoolhouse steps with Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Brennan. The three men shared a comfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts about the events. "Of the past week, made up your mind yet?" Coleman asked eventually. Marcus fingered the silver locket in his pocket, thinking about Lucy's words and Jake's wisdom and the faces of all the people who had welcomed him into their community. He thought about the $4 million buried under tons of rock and realized that he'd never felt richer in his life. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I have." The next morning, Marcus walked into the temporary federal office and handed Agent Chen back her witness protection documents, unsigned. "I appreciate the offer," he told her, "but I've decided to stay." Chen studied his face, looking for any sign of uncertainty. "Mr. Dalton, I need to be clear about what you're risking. These people have resources we're still discovering. Your life will be in constant danger." "Maybe. But running away won't change that. If they want me badly enough, they'll find me wherever I go. At least here, I won't be facing them alone." Chen nodded slowly, though her expression remained concerned. "In that case, we'll do everything we can to provide protection. Regular patrols, secure communications, federal marshals on standby. But ultimately, your safety will depend on your own vigilance and the support of your community." "I understand. There's one more thing." Chen pulled out a final document, this one bearing the seal of the Treasury Department. "Federal law provides for rewards to citizens whose actions lead to the recovery of stolen assets or the conviction of major criminals. Your cooperation in this investigation has been instrumental in dismantling a network that stole over $50 million in mineral rights." She handed him the document, and Marcus nearly dropped it when he saw the figure at the bottom. $500,000. "It's not $4 million, Chen said with a slight smile, "but it should be enough to get you started on whatever comes next." Marcus stared at the check, his mind reeling. $500,000 was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having, enough to buy a ranch, start a business, and build a real life in Pine Ridge. But as he looked around the temporary office at the evidence of corporate corruption and human suffering, he knew that the money wasn't the real reward. The real reward was the knowledge that Jeremiah's sacrifice had meant something, that good people had stood together against impossible odds and won. Walking out of the federal office into the bright Montana morning, Marcus Dalton felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his parents as a young man. He felt like he was home. 6 months after the battle at Silver Canyon, Marcus Dalton stood in the doorway of his new general store, watching the morning bustle of Pine Ridge's main street. The town had transformed in the months since Mountain Development Corporation's downfall. New businesses had opened, families had returned to reclaimed properties, and the constant undercurrent of fear that had plagued the community for years had finally lifted. The federal reward money had allowed Marcus to purchase the old Henderson building and convert it into Pine Ridge's first proper general store in decades. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd lost a $4 million inheritance, but gained something far more valuable. A place in a community that had accepted him as family. Sheriff Coleman approached, no longer wearing a cast but still favoring his left arm slightly. "Morning, Marcus. Got some news from Helena you'll want to hear." Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he always kept brewing for customers and neighbors who stopped by to chat. In the months since the federal investigation concluded, such informal gatherings had become a daily ritual, a way for the community to stay connected and process everything they'd been through together. "Vincent Crane's trial starts next week," Coleman continued. "Federal prosecutors say they've got enough evidence to put him away for 3 consecutive life sentences. Fraud, murder, conspiracy, violation of federal racketeering laws, the works." Marcus nodded, feeling a satisfaction that went deeper than simple revenge. Justice had been slow in coming, but it was finally arriving. "What about the others, the people higher up the chain?" "That's really good news. Remember those documents Captain Mitchell got to Helena? They've led to indictments against 2 senators, a defense contractor, and the entire board of directors of Western Mining Consolidated. Turns out Mountain Development Corporation was just one tentacle of something much bigger." Through the store window, Marcus could see Lucy Morrison walking to school, her bright laughter carrying across the street as she played with friends. The girl who had shown such courage during the helicopter attack had grown taller in the past months, but she still stopped by the store every afternoon to help stock shelves and share stories about her day. "Any word on recovering the family's losses?" Marcus asked. Coleman's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "The federal court ordered full restitution last month. Every family that was cheated by the corporation is getting their money back, plus interest and damages. Jake Morrison alone is getting enough to rebuild his saloon twice over." The news should have made Marcus happy, but he found himself thinking about the families who would never see full justice, the people who had died resisting the corporation's pressure. No amount of money could bring back Pete Hawkins or the dozen other victims whose deaths had been covered up as accidents. As if reading his thoughts, Coleman's expression grew more serious. "There's something else. Agent Chen called this morning. They found evidence that Jeremiah's death wasn't natural causes after all." Marcus set down his coffee cup, his hands suddenly unsteady. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed, it still hit like a physical blow. "Poison," Coleman continued quietly. "Slow-acting, designed to mimic heart failure in an elderly man. They found traces in his coffee tin, probably administered during one of Crane's visits." For a moment Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to plant dynamite charges rather than let Crane have the silver. But then he thought about Lucy's words about heroes, about Jake Morrison's philosophy of choosing to be alive rather than just safe. "At least we know the truth now," he said finally. "Jeremiah died fighting for what was right. That means something." The morning passed quietly, with the usual stream of customers and neighbors stopping by for supplies or conversation. Mrs. Weatherby brought fresh eggs from her ranch, refusing payment as usual despite Marcus's protests. Tom Wilson from the feed store stopped by to discuss a joint order of winter supplies that would save both businesses money. But it was Jake Morrison's visit just before noon that brought the day's biggest surprise. The old saloon keeper entered the store carrying a leather satchel and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant important business. "Marcus, we need to talk. Privately." They went into the back room that served as Marcus's office and living quarters. Jake set the satchel on the small table and opened it, revealing a stack of official-looking documents. "Remember how the federal investigation turned up all those shell companies and hidden assets?" Jake began. "Well, it seems your great-uncle was smarter than any of us realized." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Jeremiah didn't just hide silver in that cave. He hid money in banks across 3 states, all under assumed names, with proper legal documentation. The federal agents found it when they were tracing corporate assets." Jake's eyes twinkled with something approaching mischief. "Seems he'd been selling refined silver for years, building up a war chest for exactly the kind of fight we just had." The documents Jake spread out told an incredible story. Jeremiah Dalton had maintained accounts in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco under various carefully constructed identities. Each account contained substantial deposits, proceeds from silver sales that he'd been accumulating for over a decade. "How much?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "All told, about $800,000, plus interest accrued over the years." Jake looked directly at Marcus. "It's all yours, legally. The federal court confirmed it yesterday." Marcus stared at the documents, his mind reeling. Combined with his reward money, he would have over $1 million. Not the $4 million the cave had contained, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. "There's more," Jake continued. "The federal government is offering to buy that collapsed cave site from you. They want to turn it into a memorial for the victims of corporate violence, maybe build a visitor center to educate people about what happened here." "How much are they offering?" $200,000. It's not about the money, though. It's about making sure people remember, making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful street where children played and neighbors chatted. The town that had almost been destroyed by corporate greed was thriving again, rebuilt on a foundation of community cooperation rather than individual profit. "I'll take their offer," he said finally, "but I want the memorial to include everyone who died fighting the corporation, not just the victims. Sheriff's deputies, townspeople, even Jeremiah. They all deserve to be remembered." Jake nodded approvingly. "I thought you might say that. Mind if I ask what you're planning to do with all this money?" Marcus had been thinking about that question for months, ever since Agent Chen had first mentioned the federal reward. The old Marcus would have seen it as an opportunity for escape, a chance to disappear into comfortable anonymity somewhere, far from Pine Ridge. But the new Marcus, the man who had been forged in the fires of community struggle, had different priorities. 1 year after inheriting a rotting cabin, Marcus Dalton stood before a crowd of over 200 people gathered for the dedication of the Jeremiah Dalton Memorial Park. The federal government had moved quickly on their promise, transforming the site of the collapsed cave into a beautiful memorial that honored all the victims of corporate violence in the region. Governor Stevens had come from Helena to speak, along with congressional representatives and federal officials who had worked on the case. But the people Marcus cared about most were the ones from Pine Ridge, The families who had lost loved ones, the survivors who had rebuilt their lives, and the children who would grow up in a community free from the kind of fear that had once plagued these mountains. Lucy Morrison, now 13 and taller than Marcus remembered, stood near the front of the crowd. She had helped design the memorial's centerpiece, a bronze statue depicting a mountain man protecting a child, surrounded by plaques bearing the names of everyone who had died in the struggle against Mountain Development Corporation. When it came time for Marcus to speak, he found himself looking not at the crowd, but at the mountains that surrounded them. Somewhere up there, in a cave filled with rubble and memories, lay the remains of a fortune that had cost more lives than it was worth. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "a year ago, I thought I'd inherited a cabin worth $5 and got a bargain. Turned out I'd actually inherited something worth millions of dollars and nearly got killed for it." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus had discovered that he actually enjoyed public speaking, something that would have terrified the old hermit version of himself. "But standing here today, looking at all of you, I realize I was wrong about what I inherited. I didn't inherit silver or money or property. I inherited something much more valuable. I inherited a community." He gestured toward the memorial, where the bronze figures caught the afternoon sunlight. "My great-uncle Jeremiah spent years preparing for a war he knew was coming. He stockpiled weapons and supplies and silver, thinking that's what it would take to protect what mattered to him. But what really won that war wasn't any amount of precious metal. It was people choosing to stand together, to risk everything, for their neighbors." Marcus paused, his eyes finding familiar faces in the crowd. Sheriff Coleman, who had risked his career to support a stranger's claims. Deputy Brennan, who had guided him through dangerous mountains when escape seemed impossible. Jake Morrison, whose courage had rallied an entire town to fight back against impossible odds. "The real treasure was never in that cave," Marcus continued. "It was in the hearts of people who chose to do what was right, even when it was dangerous. It was in the wisdom of children who understood that heroes don't run away from trouble. It was in the determination of families who refused to be driven from their homes by fear." He pulled out a piece of paper, the deed to his general store, which had become the unofficial community center for Pine Ridge. "Which is why I'm announcing today that I'm donating the proceeds from Jeremiah's hidden accounts to establish the Pine Ridge Community Foundation. The money will go to helping families start businesses, kids go to college, and making sure that no one in this county ever has to face financial pressure from outside corporations alone." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus held up his hand for quiet. He had one more thing to say, something he'd been thinking about for months. "I came to Pine Ridge as a broke mountain man with nothing to offer anybody. I'm leaving here, well, I'm not leaving, but if I was, I'd be leaving as the richest man I know. Not because of money in a bank account, but because I learned something that my great-uncle knew all along. True wealth isn't what you can hoard for yourself. It's something you can share with others." After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse and the sun started to set behind the western peaks, Marcus found himself alone with Lucy Morrison at the memorial. The girl, young woman now really, had been quiet throughout the afternoon's festivities. "Penny for your thoughts?" Marcus asked. Lucy smiled, but there was something melancholy in her expression. "I was just thinking about all the people who aren't here. The ones who died before they could see how this story ended." Marcus nodded, understanding her mood. "Your great-grandmother, whose locket you gave me. She would have been proud of you. Do you really think the memorial will help? Will people remember what happened here?" Marcus looked at the bronze figures, noting how the artist had captured both strength and compassion in their faces. "I think people will remember the lesson, even if they forget the details. That good folk standing together can overcome almost anything. That community is stronger than money, that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what they cost." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the last of the visitors make their way down the mountain trail. Finally, Lucy spoke again. "What's next for you? I mean, you could go anywhere now, do anything you want." Marcus considered the question. With over $1 million in the bank and a thriving business, he could indeed go anywhere, do anything. He could buy a mansion in Denver, travel the world, live a life of luxury that the broke mountain man of a year ago couldn't have imagined. But looking at Pine Ridge spread out in the valley below, at the smoke rising from familiar chimneys and the lights beginning to twinkle in windows where friends and neighbors were settling in for the evening, Marcus knew there was nowhere else he'd rather be. "I think I'll stay right here," he said. "Keep running the store, help families get back on their feet, maybe do some prospecting in the high country when the mood strikes me. Simple life, but a good one." Lucy smiled, the melancholy finally lifting from her expression. "Grandpa Jake says you've got the stubborn streak of anyone he's ever met. Says once you plant roots somewhere, nothing short of dynamite could move you." Marcus laughed, remembering the dynamite charges he'd lit in the cave, choosing to destroy a fortune rather, then let it fall into the wrong hands. "Your grandfather's a wise man, and he's not wrong about the stubborn part." As they walked back toward town, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been nobody special, just another mountain man scraping by, on the edges of society. Today he was a respected member of a thriving community, a successful businessman, and according to the governor's speech, a hero whose actions had helped expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in the history of the American West. But the title that meant the most to him was the simplest one: neighbor, friend, family. The rotting cabin that had started it. All was long gone, buried under tons of rock, along with the silver that had almost cost so many lives. In its place stood something far more valuable, a community that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, bound together by shared sacrifice and common purpose. Marcus Dalton had inherited a fortune and lost it in the same week. But he had gained something that no amount of money could buy: a home, a family, and the knowledge that true wealth came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could give back to it. As the stars began to appear in the clear Montana sky, Marcus walked through the streets of Pine Ridge toward his store, his home, and his future. Behind him, the memorial caught the last rays of sunlight, a permanent reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you're willing to sacrifice for others. The broken mountain man's greatest inheritance hadn't been silver after, or it had been the chance to discover who he really was and what really mattered in life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.